Okay, Flowering Christianity, Chapter 8. A lot going on in this chapter. We're going to try to get through as much of it as we can here. Um, okay, so Jerusalem falls uh, to the Romans, and it was renamed from Judea, the land of the Jews, to Palestine, the land of the Philistines, which is really interesting because the Philistines didn't exist anymore. We still call it Palestine. We still call it that area of Palestine today, um, and there's still conflict today, and we'll get into a little bit more of that down the road. Um, but basically, Judaism, its culture got erased for a thousand years until after World War II. The Allied powers basically went in and kicked the people off of their land who had lived there for 1,000 years and said, this doesn't belong to you anymore." And they allowed people of Jewish faith and Jewish background to move into this area. Um, and you see why that could be a problem. Imagine somebody conquering part of the U.S. And just kicking everybody off and saying, "Okay, this belongs to the Native Americans," um, and people would go, "But my family has lived here for 300 years. Don't care." Imagine that being not 300 years, but 1,000 years living in a place and being kicked off your land. And this is what happened in the Middle East. All right. All right. So terms to know. One, the messianic, which deals with the Messiah, okay, or the anointed one. Um, the Realize that Jewish faith in the Messiah, we tend to think of the Messiah as a spiritual leader. Jews thought of the Messiah as a very physical one, someone who's going to lead a someone who's going to lead a rebellion against the Jews or against the Romans. And so Christ didn't line up with that concept. Um, the At this time, various kings put temples of the Greek gods, to put a temple of Zeus in the temple, for example, allowed pigs to be sacrificed there. The pigs, of course, to Jews being very unclean, offending their faith in pretty much any way possible. Um, so there was the Maccabean Revolution against Rome, which for a period of about 80 years um, drove out the Romans until in 63 BCE, Pompey came in and pretty much took over. Um, there were several sects of Jews. Sects, sects, sect, like section. Um, you have the Pharisees, which were scribes. They were very much a group of the people. The Sadducees, which were associated more with the aristocracy, and the Essenes. And the Essenes were this very hermetic, disciplined group. Um, and usually within a sect, they describe all of their people are good. Everything outside of their people are evil. And we don't see anything like that today, do we? Um, the uh, the Pharisees, the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection of the dead, while the Pharisees did. Um, the Essenes, um, one of the things about the Essenes is their documentation, including the Dead Sea Scrolls, is one of the things they're best known for. Including most of the books of the Old Testament that we now have were kept by the Essenes. Over time, you've probably heard of Herod the Great. Herod's sons ruled after his death. Rome became less and less tolerant of the Jewish faith. Because the Jewish faith, whereas basically the Jewish faith said that their faith was first and foremost what defined them. if you were to be a Roman citizen, you were a Roman first and everything else second. And the constant denial of the of Roman authority as the supreme power was in large what drove the Romans to destroy the Jews. Um, as we look at Christianity, Christ uh, Christ was very focused on, and much in the same way as Judaism, was focused on reform. Um, he was against the practice of money changing, which alienated the Sadducees because that's how they made their money. Um, Christ never claimed to be the Messiah. Interestingly enough, Jesus Christ never claimed to be the Messiah. His followers claimed that. Christ did not. And this would become more of an issue as we look at the future of the church. The proclamation that he was the Son of God was a basically an attack on Roman law because the emperor was supposed to be the only divine human. Um, and so, since Jews were monotheistic, they refused to worship other gods, this was also a threat to Rome. Um, so one of the things that the Pharisees and the Essenes both believed in resurrection of the dead. So Christ's resurrection was also seen within the Jewish faith of the time. Now, most of the spreading of Christ's gospel was done by his apostles, the people who knew him. One of the big exceptions to this is Paul. Uh, and Paul claimed that Christ came to him in a vision. And it's really interesting because Paul, if you look at most of the books of the New Testament, Paul wrote a lot of those, and Paul never knew Christ. So there are those who, and a lot of Paul's beliefs and approaches greatly differed from those who actually knew Christ. Um, he actually coined the term Christ, which means the anointed one. Jesus never called himself Christ. None of his apostles called him Christ. That was strictly something created by Paul. Um, for Paul, Paul's really the one who's pushed that crucifixion was the act of salvation for humanity. Um, Resurrection being the ultimate expression of the uh, Christian faith. Um, we see this gap that comes along further in Christian tradition, and we'll look at this more closely, between those who believed that you had to act in a certain way and those who believed that faith alone was enough to save you. And this ends up being the schism in the church. Paul is also the one who pushed this idea of not having sex if you were completely pure, which is why priests don't have sex, is because Paul said that was the best thing, and you end up with literally hundreds of thousands of millions of people over centuries supposed to conform to this idea of the body being something wicked and having sex as a distraction from God. Um, Paul did some things that really kind of messed us up, quite frankly. Um, looking at the Gospels, okay. Taking a look, we have the evangelists, coming from the Greek evangelos, meaning bearer of good, also having the root of angel within it, who spread the word of God. You have the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, which tell the same stories in the same sequence. Though they differ in their details, they're basically the same stories. It is interesting to note some of the differences between early Christianity and later Christianity. A lot of early Christians did not believe in the virgin birth. They did not believe, in fact, that Christ was God. That's something that came later. Many Christians said, yeah, he is here to show us the Word of God, but he is not divine himself, and Christ never claimed divinity for himself. Parables is a short story designed to convey a larger truth, whereas an allegory is the representation of abstract terms or spiritual meaning through concrete and material terms, very closely related concepts. All right. There are Gnostic Gospels. These are things to know about. The Gnostic Gospels are those that other versions of Jesus' life other than those that were contained in the Bible. There are things written by... There was never anybody that sat down and said, okay, these belong in the Bible. There was kind of a tradition that said these things kind of go together, and so, as we're putting things together, let's put these ones together. And what was kept and what kept in and what was left out changed over time. There were books going in and out, but there's all kinds of things that are left out because it didn't suit the political and cultural aims of the people at the time. There are Gospels that claim that Christ was married to Mary Magdalene, which would make sense, quite frankly, because Jews at that of his age were married. To not be married would have been unheard of. Okay, to think that Christ was not married is just, it doesn't align with the times at all. One of the things that there's the Gospel of Judas, which talks about how Judas quote unquote betrayed Christ, but he did so because Christ told him to, as opposed to Judas was this scoundrel who went behind his back. The Gospel of Thomas says that Christ had a twin brother. There's other books that talk about, for example, Lilith. Eve was not Adam's first wife. According to this, Adam's first wife was Lilith, who didn't want to have sex with him. And so God threw her out of the garden because she didn't want to have sex with Adam. So what the church would do is anything that was written that didn't align with what the church wanted you to believe was called heresy, and you were thrown out. And people who practiced things and believed in it, even if there was documentation for it, they would persecute people. So people who follow the Gnostic Gospels tend to believe in a transcendent and impersonal God, as opposed to the active God that Christianity tends to believe in now. God made the world, yes, but he kind of set it in motion and let it go. And that the material world is not a good thing, and that there is a heavenly world that's ruled by light. Christianity came to say, well, no, humans are inherently good, but fallen in sin, and it takes Christ to redeem you. So, just some of the differences. Realize that Christ never thought of himself as anything but a Jew. Okay, Jesus never thought of himself as anything but a Jew. And so, it's interesting that there's been this whole religion based on his teachings when he would say, no, I was Jewish, and that's what I believed. Christianity followed the Hebrew Scriptures, or looked at the Hebrew Scriptures, but they believed that the books of the Hebrew Torah were actually a prefiguring or prophetic of the life of Christ. They kept trying to make the things fit, which I guess if you try hard enough, you can make anything fit. Christians developed many symbols that help to identify them to each other. We see, for example, at the bottom of page 261, the Alpha and the Omega symbol, right? Where Christ saying, where God says, "I am the beginning and the end." We see, of course, the images such as "I am the Good Shepherd," and it's really interesting to me how Christ, who preached nonviolence and loving each other, and his followers are like, fucking kill the world. a lot of the time, right? Um, there's if he somehow become mistyped as somebody who says we have to kill our enemies, that we have to have guns are the important thing, that we it, so much has been lost, and it's not just modern times, and it's not just Christianity, but a lot of organized religion has taken the tenets of their beliefs and turned them around on from something peaceful into something violent, um, totally contradicting what their founding doctrines say. Love your enemy. Um, Somehow that's been construed as hoard as many weapons as possible, right? By some followers. All right, Christian Rome. Uh, so we have Diocletian, who is the emperor of Rome, and Diocletian uh, spent years persecuting Christians. Okay, really coming down on them. And then when Constantine came into government, or came into rule, Constantine recognized the power of Christianity, and rather than fight it, he embraced it and harnessed it for his own uh, uses. Um, he erected the city of Constantinople, now called Istanbul, in modern Turkey, um, and he did not persecute paganism, but he did reject pagan practice and favored Christians as officials within his court, and admitted Christian clergy to his court. He also brought together the first ecumenical council to start saying what is Christianity, and to start bringing basically all Christianity under one roof, and to throw out that which was not considered to be the correct take on Christianity. We'll talk about the Bishop Arius here in just a minute. One of the main things that the Nicene Creed said is that there is one church. Okay, there is one church, the one holy and Catholic apostolic church. So realize that this is where we start to see the coming together of the Catholic Church, which was the only Christian church in the Western world, anyway, for literally hundreds of years. Okay, the liturgy, the rites prescribed for public services, was established. What is supposed to happen, in what order, how it's supposed to happen. There was also the Vulgate Bible, which came to be the Latin Bible, which was the official Bible of the church for over 1,000 years. And the Vulgate Bible had such an impact on Western culture because it was considered to be the Word of God. One of the things that we see at this time is also the breaking in art away from naturalism. And we looked before, right, at how the Greeks and the Romans represented the body perfectly in its natural state and as close to the correct anatomy as possible. And there's a movement away from that. There's less attempts at true depth and substance, and more of a symbolic representation becomes important at this time. If we look on 268, right, we see the statue of Constantine with the huge, massive, almost anime eyes, supposed to be eyes looking into heaven. Nobody has eyes that big. I mean, that's ridiculous, right? But this is supposed to represent his looking at God, which is more important than physical accuracy. Okay, we see the basilica churches looking at 268 and the image there on 269. These massive, giant structures of worship, right? And again, it's interesting how a church that was supposed to be dedicated to a carpenter and somebody who wandered his whole life and who said it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to go to heaven, to get these huge adorned churches. But the thought being, okay, there's this more perfect world beyond, and we have to represent that here on earth, right? Um, all right, let's talk about syncretism. Syncretism is where you take two different religions and you bring them together into a meeting of the minds. And Christianity had a pagan problem because pagans did not want to give up a lot of their traditions. And so instead, what people did was they kind of blended things together to say, oh, it's okay. Um, so, for example, one of the best examples I can think of is the day of worship. Um, Pagans worshipped on Sunday, the day of the sun. Right? This is the day where we worship the sun. Um, well, Christ was a Jew. Christianity was based on Jewish traditions, and they worship from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. Okay, because evening and the morning is the first day. God rested on the seventh day. And this was one of the big sticking points as far as getting pagans to convert to Christianity. And so what the Catholic Church said is, okay, well, Christ rose on Sunday, so that's really the holy day. He changed it then. Now, the reason for that had nothing to do with when Christ rose. It had to do with the fact that we can't get people to convert, and Christians don't really want to be all that Jewish, and maybe if we can change this thing, it'll be easier to get people to convert. That's why the change was made. Had nothing to do with the day that Christ rose. In fact, if you want to really look at it, the Sabbath is supposed to be a day of rest. Christ died on a Friday, rose on a Sunday, which means he rested on Saturday. Okay, so in looking at the history of syncretism, this is one of the big examples that we see. Talking about Easter, right? Well, if we look at Easter now, what do we think of Easter? We think of eggs. We think of bunnies, right? We think of chicks, right? Let me tell you a story about where Easter comes from. The goddess Astara, okay, in tradition, was wandering along. She came across a bird in the snow, and the bird was injured and it was in trouble. And to save the bird, she turned the bird into a rabbit. And the rabbit became her companion. Okay? In fact, not just her companion, it became her lover. Astara was a fertility goddess. Okay? And so Astara had this rabbit for a lover, and then she found out, because rabbits are, as we know, like to reproduce and multiply, the rabbit was sleeping with other goddesses. And she became furious. And so she took the rabbit and she threw it into the sky to be condemned for all eternity in the sky, beneath the foot of Achilles the hunter. Or of Orion. Sorry, not Achilles, Orion. And eventually she regretted it, and one day out of the year, Astara, where the word Easter comes from the goddess Astara, she allowed him to come back to Earth because of course he was a bird, initially, to spread eggs. And this is where all of your Easter traditions come from. And so by talking about Christ on that day, right, hey, we can kind of combine these two things together. Of course, the Mithras cult, right? Christ was born in the spring, not in December. We know this because we know when the census was taken. We don't know exactly what day, but we know he was born in the spring. But in order to appease the Zoroastrians, right? We'll celebrate it then on the day when Mithras was born, because they're really kind of the same person. So we end up with these crossovers between paganism and Christianity that Christianity certainly doesn't want to admit to. But so much of Christianity is rooted in paganism, especially holiday traditions, etc. All right, Augustine. Augustine. This is not the Emperor Augustine. This is Saint Augustine. Very different person. Don't get the two of them mixed up because very, very different. So Augustine. Really, kind of the first autobiography. Again, one of these people who, like Paul, thought of sexuality as an inferior state of being. Early Christians, oh my God, had this thing against sex that has pervaded Christianity ever since. A lot of Romans blame Christians for the fall of Rome, but Augustine argued that in fact it was paganism and the arrogance of the emperors to try to be like God that condemned Rome to fall. Because you have a mortal trying to be God, and rather than letting God be God and following him. He believed that history goes from darkness to light, body to soul, evil to goodness, doubt to faith. Right? There's this dualism that we see throughout his writings. And he sees the Bible in much the same way. Okay? All right. Going back a little bit to Constantine. Constantine built Constantinople. Rome was built in these 7 hills, which was great for travel and everything, but it was not easily defensible. It just wasn't. And that's part of the reason why it kept getting sacked by quote-unquote barbarians over the time. So when Constantine built Constantinople, he built it on a peninsula that was easily defendable. You could only come at it from the land from one side, and he was able to set up defenses against ships invasion from all around. Okay. The other thing we start to see during in Constantinople is this idea of with pagan works that they weren't. Yes, while they were relics of pagan religion, they were also art, and you could think of them just in terms of art. And this was a new approach. Roman law did remain the norm in Byzantine culture, but as time went on, we see more and more of his successors eliminating pagan culture until Justinian closed the Academy of Athens, which was the last pagan school of thought within the empire. All right, let's talk about Arians. The Arians were the followers of Bishop Arius, not to be and that's Arians. Okay, followers of Arius as opposed to Arayans, like the Aryan nation. Okay, two different things. But the followers of Arius believed that Christ and God were separate. Okay, they were not made of the same stuff, so to speak. Whereas the emperor at the time, Justinian, said that God and Christ were one. And now, this was the Arians were based out of Ravenna, and Ravenna is a city that at the time had a smaller city, but had a lot of power, had a lot of wealth, well positioned, very artistic city. And Justinian used this difference of opinion to justify sacking Ravenna. Okay, it was a port city, a hub of trade, and so he probably made a bigger deal of this difference than he really needed to, because it allowed him an excuse to take over this key town and to make himself substantially more wealthy and powerful. Okay. During As Justinian had this campaign to rebuild Constantinople, okay, he built a new Hagia Sophia, okay, which means holy wisdom, okay, this massive, gorgeous church. Look at pictures of the Hagia Sophia if you ever get a chance. Okay, just Google it. It's amazing. But there was this period of unrest as he was going through this, and he actually considered abandoning Constantinople. But his wife convinced him not to. And the Hagia Sophia may have actually served as a construction project to distract people from rioting. Okay, if you look at 278, you can see some of the pictures of the Hagia Sophia. It is absolutely, absolutely gorgeous. I really quickly want to talk about some of the Byzantium mural mosaics. Of course, murals are made up of mosaics are made up of small pieces of glass, shell, bone, whatever, to form an image. Okay, and the way that the Byzantines did this was really incredible, because most people try to get it flat. Okay. And they actually did the opposite. So they would take these pieces of glass, and when they set them in, they would set them in slightly askew so that they would kind of come out of the wall a little bit at angles, so that when light would hit it, it would refract at different angles and provide just this beautiful sparkling effect. It was really incredible. Again, we 281 talked about the abandonment of naturalism. We lose things such as shadow. We lose depth. Right? Images become very flat, very two-dimensional, because the beauty of the piece is less important than what it represents, and representation became the priority. Things all looked very much alike. You lost individuality. Feet, hands, faces, right? It's like you pick and choose certain ones, and you just use the same things over and over again. It wasn't the most interesting artwork, quite honestly. I don't like this period. I don't. I have friends that just adore this, and yeah, I can't take it. Music became looked at as a branch of math in a lot of ways, because it's on scales, and while there is math in music, again, you lose some of the beauty of creativity that can come of music. All right. Let's talk about iconoclasm. Iconoclasm is this movement to get rid of images, or religious images. Of course, with the Ten Commandments, thou shalt worship no graven images, right? And there was this thought among some at the time that images of God or images of saints were, when people came to them in honor, to think of them and to find a way to address God through them, the people were worshiping the images. And so you end up with this idea of it's okay, we've got to destroy them, right? This led to the destruction of just so many beautiful works of art. And there were people who tried to protect them. The Emperor Leo attempted to destroy artwork, and because he had victories over Muslims at the time, he's like, oh yeah, God says that my destruction of artwork is a good thing, because those two are somehow connected. The people who believed in artwork said, look, the people who are before these things aren't worshiping the art, but rather their veneration goes on not to the art, but to what the art represents. This is really kind of what brings in the visual literacy. And visual literacy, the idea of being able to read an image, becomes very important. It's actually a field that's still studied today. I did a lot of studying this in my doctoral program. And you end up with this big division in the church between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. This happened near the end of the first millennium, or the last half of the first millennium. Okay, so really about 750 on to, or 730 on to about 1000. So you have the Roman Catholic Church in the west and the Orthodox Church in the east. In the west, the Roman Catholics believed in having these images, whereas in the east, they did not. The Western Church believed in the power of the Pope. The Eastern Church did not. So this division was really driven in by different things, but one of the big ones was iconoclasm. The early Christian art emphasized Christ's power, his wisdom, his personal strength, but we start to see more of these images of Christ on the cross, of him bleeding, of his sacrifice coming through during this time. Okay? All right. Yeah, that's where we're going to. Okay. As always, please keep up with your discussion boards. These are your attendants. Do not forget. If you have any questions, hit me up on Remind. And I will see you all soon.